Welcome, everybody. It is our second, I'm thinking second, pretty sure it's February. Yep, second recording and virtual panel. I'm Mike Tresca, your host, and I'm pleased to announce that I have also been named both a board member, and the board voted me into committee chair. So I'm very excited to start fresh. In theory, this is the way it should work, which is in January we do our voting, in February we actually announce the votes. We're going to try and keep that up, which is fantastic. I'm honored to be on the board as well as your chair for another year. We're going to keep doing this, which is these virtual panels, which I love to do. Obviously, I must because, you know, I keep coming back. And we're excited to introduce a few housekeeping items before we talk to our esteemed guests. So a couple of things. We had a vote, which I'm very excited about. And that vote was to get all our board members nominated. We now have 5 slots. So I've mentioned before, the health of an organization is not determined by just the actual outcome of the votes. It's the fact that people vote at all. And for a couple of years there, no one was voting. I'm very pleased to say that a majority of the population voted. And that to me is a great sign of CAR-PGA health. So I'm much happier because I thought I was going to have a grim conversation with you all again about why it's important to vote. I didn't have to do that. So we are on the right path, which is fantastic. And I'm pleased to welcome my colleagues. That is David Millions. You will know him from the newsletter. He manages that. Ted Skirvin. Ted is the person who was frankly behind this idea and provides many of the recommendations of our guests, including our guest coming up, Hawk Robinson, who you know does massive work in the RPG space in the community. And of course, Dr. Alan White. Dr. Alan White was a guest, actually, so he's well introduced to this group and his work as well. So that's 5. So going forward, I hope we have a 5-member board. It does mean that some of us may be voted off in the future, and that's healthy and okay, including me. And I may not be the chair in the future, and that's okay. And I think that's great. That is the way an organization should work. But I am very pleased that we have a full roster. So welcome everyone. That's not the only good news, though. We also have several new members. 1, 2, 3, 4 new members. We got a new one in between while I was looking. So we're very happy to introduce Bob Carter, George Bergstrom, Trevor Chapman, who's on. Trevor, say hi. Hi, Trevor, and Angel Smith. So happy to have all 4 new members. Again, you will see in the annual report, one of the things is growth. That's one of the goals of the CAR-PGA, and we are on track. In fact, now we're way on track. I think we were hoping to get 1 person a month, and we are well beyond that at this rate. There's no guarantee we'll keep it up, but we hope so. So certainly I'd love to see 12 more members. That'd be great. Maybe we can go to 24, but I'm very excited to see us on track. So things are good. I have to really say, everything from conventions and the open game license situation, I'm happy to say seems to mostly have resolved. There's still some nagging concerns that we think could be potentially an issue, but overall, I'm not having nightmares about what I'm going to do about my products, which is a good thing. And I've certainly talked to the Enworld team and the EM Publishing team, and I think there's a general sense that we're sort of going in hopefully a positive direction that's not going to be utterly disruptive to the industry. So there could be a new issue next month, but for the moment, we'll take the win. And I think we are in a good place, both the CAR-PGA and the gaming industry overall. So speaking of the gaming industry, I'm very excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Tanya Pobuda. I said that right? Did I say it right, Dr. Pobuda?
Beautiful.
Okay. All right. If I do that, everything, it's all up from here. I'm very excited to have you here. Obviously, this was something we discussed for a little bit, probably last year. Yes. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for being flexible with your time. I appreciate that. And I can't wait you're also a member, so you certainly know everything I just mentioned, which I'm excited about. But I'm also excited. I know you have some stuff to share with us. So we'll dive right in. Let me I can use pins. There we go. So usually when we start, just to sort of give us a grounding and sort of put us in context to start the conversation, we talk a little bit about gaming background. So I know this isn't a surprise to you, but if you just give us a little bit about not just your gaming background and how you got started, but where you ended up to where you are today, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, 100%. So we were just talking just off camera about my long history. In fact, we were talking a little satanic panic. Yes. Because my hometown was in the grips of this ridiculous satanic panic. I even worked at my town library, and as my a head librarian was getting rid of books that might encourage people into Satanism and witchcraft, I would go to the back, save the books, take them home. So I have lived through some early days of role playing, and have a very, very long history with. I've been playing tabletop games since the 70s, which is totally dating myself. And no one ever looked good in these shirts. This is my Rim class. I put together slides because I am that person. So
I love the jean jacket and the glasses guy too. That's
you know what? Nobody looked good in the early 80s. This is me looking very very androgynous with the David Cassidy hair. It was the Tony Home haircut. And my lineage. I also took the job at my local library so I could win at Trivial Pursuit, which is like incredibly sad. And I was that person that memorized the cards, and we had pickings were slim. In northern Alberta, which is where I'm from, sort of west and very north in Canada, the coldest place you'll ever experience. And no one knows this game. People, tell me that it's really not that great a game, but I was obsessed with this game, Masterpiece. And I actually just got a vintage version of it sitting right behind me that I must remediate at some point. So yeah, long history. I also tried as a super nerdy David Cassidy haired girl to try and get into my junior high Dungeons and Dragons team, running the gauntlet of, satanic panic librarians, my parents, and they told me no, because girls don't play Dungeons and Dragons, which made me really sad because I really, really wanted to play. So that's my early games history. And again, really dating myself here. So I'm fully aware.
Yes, and I apologize on behalf of everyone that was your experience. I'm sorry to hear that, but unfortunately not necessarily surprising. Like you said, you had multiple factors. You had both the satanic panic and there's sort of general misogyny and all kinds of other issues with who was supposed to play the game, right? So sorry to hear that. So how did you go from there to where you are today? I mean, you've come a long way, obviously. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I have a very strange history, but there is a through line, I think. I was explaining this to, I did a postdoc interview a couple days ago, and, from saving books from literally the town dump to, becoming a tech reporter, it's all about, trying to make information available to folks, sometimes information that people maybe, feel a little reticent to learn. So I was a tech reporter. I, in the early 90s, met Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, lots of the big players in tech, and then moved into working in branding, actually, with large corporations. And then I decided to go back to school because one of the interesting things, and this is a bit of a through line too, is I noticed that there were some things that really delimited. I watched it happen in early tech around, issues with not really welcoming new audiences into products. So in early tech, there was this huge thing about, nobody besides an engineer with a pocket protector is going to care about early computing. This is not for women. This is not for kids. That no one's ever going to, and I had clients who literally would say, no one needs a computer in their home. A lot of those companies that I supported, who I really tried to get, turned around on that, no longer exist. And I saw in gaming some of the same sort of tropes, right? And so one of the things, this was an article I read years ago and sort of was reacquainted with it, while I was doing my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, was this idea of like, sometimes it's really hard to see what's going on unless you sort of create a bit of an empirical sweep, right? You have to look for a pattern. And one of the big sort of, evocations that this particular author, Mia Consalvo, who's amazing, said is you got to look at anecdotes. People kind of can talk around them like, oh, that's just one person experience. What did they do? Were they difficult? That kind of thing can easily be kind of dismissed. So you need to look at patterns. And it just so happened that my background in tech, and when I went into comms, was around dashboarding, looking at the health of a particular sector, product line performance. I made dashboards for corporations. And one of the things that a lot of corporate types, senior leaders often would say to me is, numbers don't lie. And you have to look for sort of those empirical sweeps in terms of, okay, is there a pattern? And so one of the first things I did, because I wanted to get a bit of what I would do for clients, right? And I wanted to kind of look at the tabletop sector, and see what was going on. And I had a very rosy perspective because I've been in gaming for so long, and I think I curate my collection to be super diverse. Because I'm interested in that. I'm interested in sort of off the beaten track and indie games and that sort of thing. I thought that I would look at, for example, Board Game Geek, and determine, okay, is there diversity in the mix in terms of the labor of board game design? And what I discovered was actually way bleaker than I was expecting. I was expecting a much better, more progress to have been made. And these are with the top 400 Board Game Geek ranked games. And that sample is, a lot of people come to me and say, that's a bit of a skewed sample, but you'll see in a minute why Board Game Geek isn't just board game bros. There's actually there's a tremendous amount of under the surface diversity in Board Game Geek's community, as I discovered with the research. And this is for my PhD dissertation research. I did a smaller scale survey back in 2018 for analog game studies, and people were really surprised by the results. And I got a lot of kind of backlash to that study, which was in and of itself a bit of a finding. And what I discovered is the diversity around the production, and in this case, the game design of games, was super skewed. And what you see here is, the vast majority of board game designers that are listed as being associated with those games are white men. There were 16 white women, 24 BIPOC men. That includes double count, so Eric Lang is in there a bunch of times, and 3 examples of white non-binary, which is Nikki Valens with Mansions of Madness. And then I looked at cover art, and I'll end the answer here, but looking at also the empirical sweep of cover art, I have my count mug here, Sesame Street. I literally counted the images of all of the board game covers to see, okay, from an advertising perspective, what's the empirical sweep there? What would people be left with in terms of an impression? And overwhelmingly, whiteness and maleness was, if board game covers are advertisements, which they absolutely are, what's that empirical sweep? Well, it's in fact overwhelmingly at 76.8% men in terms of presentation, like imagery, and then 82.5% is white presenting as opposed to BIPOC. And one of the out of scope things for my dissertation was, is this positive representation? I didn't look at that because I'm a white woman, white middle-aged woman, who, I can't really, I would need a panel of folks to say, okay, is the BIPOC representation, small though it is, offensive in any way? And that's something that was out of scope for this research. And then just one last thing, which really harkens back to a bunch of previous surveys or studies that were done in the hobbyist community. There was one that was really great, which was a 2016 study by Aaron Ryan, who said you're more likely to see an image of a sheep on a board game cover than a woman. And in my case, it was much more aggregate. Progress has made, small progress has been made, but you're much more likely to see a creature that doesn't exist than a human woman in terms of representation on a board game cover. So these are really some of the top line empirical findings that I discovered. And overall, that really does signal sort of whiteness, maleness in terms of a message to the market and in terms of the labor of board game design.
And was this precipitated by your dissertation, or was it in conjunction, or did the one lead to the other, like in terms of this research?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I was actually doing a completely different dissertation. I was all the way down the road. I was doing, I work in AI and natural language processing. I was making volumetric models. And essentially, it was this experiment that I was doing. It worked reasonably well, of making volumetric VR models that could speak to you, and you could have difficult workplace conversations with them to practice, tricky issues in the workplace. I still do that work, but I realized with that small scale study I did in 2018 that, and PhDs are all about novel research. I started to really worry about VR. We can see sort of the implosion of the metaverse, that it was a very elitist, it was also like kind of an elitist technology and wasn't being widely adopted. There was all kinds of issues with it. So I kind of junked, I still have all of the research, that particular dissertation. I realized there was something very novel and unstudied in tabletop. And a lot of people, I now have a network all around the world of other people who are doing this kind of research. It's been pretty inspiring to folks, apparently, which is a surprise to me, because this wasn't really happening at a scholarly level. There's a lot of work in the hobbyist community around it. So I was so happy to see like the appetite for the board game and tabletop research that I was doing, that I went to my advisor and said, there's something here, and this is much, much more novel and interesting. So I decided to do that instead.
That's amazing. So this research certainly informed what you ended up being your dissertation. And how recently did you finish your PhD?
I graduated in mid-October of last year.
Congrats! So that's soon. Congratulations! Congratulations!
Yeah, this is hot off the presses.
Yes.
Yeah, and the dissertation, hopefully, I have a couple of things in the works, but I'm actually hoping to make it into a video. I'm trying to get a book deal, but I'm trying to also make it into a video series on a channel that I work with, a YouTube channel, just to make sure that everybody gets access to this research, because that's something I promised the participants that I would do.
So this research obviously informed it, as you mentioned, and led to that. So can you walk us through a little bit more on sort of what your dissertation was, around the PhD, and sort of what was that full journey from here to there? It sounds like they're obviously pretty closely related.
Yeah, 100%. So these are some of the top line findings from a much more expansive survey that I did for this research. I'll just show you one really quick thing. The other big thing that I think a lot about from just a branding perspective is, your imagined audience, right? And so one of the things I wanted to figure out with this research is, one, what's the state of representation in board games as defined as in the hobby space? What is the state of play in terms of representation? And then does it matter to folks? Because there's often discourses that it doesn't matter. And there's a whole concept called like making do, where, you may not see yourself reflected in the media products that we consume. I remember growing up and never ever seeing a woman in cinema or television that wasn't incompetent, falling on her pumps, doing stupid stuff. And it really made me sad as a viewer, because it was like, oh man, women are useless. They're always in pumps and they have to take their shoes off and they're constantly causing problems. And it was really, really depressing to have that kind of, state of representation. So the dissertation was all about figuring out, does this matter to people? And so what I did was, with 320 participants, I asked them a whole bunch of questions about representation and whether it mattered to them that, there were playable characters that were reflective of their gender, or, did it matter that, your self-identified sexual orientation, or your gender representation, or your racial identity, does it matter that it's represented in gaming? And what I found was, yeah, it really, really does. And a lot of people, do this sort of making do, where you're like, okay, I don't see myself there, but I'll find what I can in terms of representation. I can kind of latch on to characters that sort of seem like me, and people still want a game, and they sort of try to look past that. But they're often, a lot of these interviews that I did were about gaming with a bit of discontent, right? Where it's like, ugh, I really wish this were better, but I really want a game, so I'm going to do it anyway. And so I got a really diverse sample of folks like feeding back to me. The overwhelming majority were in North America. and I really wanted to hear from underrepresented, systematically unheard voices, because a lot of the existing hobbyist surveys that I had access to were so depressingly, overwhelmingly not diverse. And it made sense, right? If it, it's kind of a vicious circle, right? Where, there's not a lot of people there, a lot of people can't see themselves, and therefore it sort of perpetuates itself
Right.
as this exclusionary circle.
Mm-hmm.
And so 60.4% of the folks that I talked to were women, identified as women. Nobody was excluded from participating in the research. 25.3% were identified as men, 9.4% non-binary. Overwhelmingly, it was unfortunately, mostly white at 74.9%. 20.4% identified as BIPOC, and about half of the sample was LGBTQ plus. And all of these other really interesting findings about die-hard board gamers. And one of the other really important things is, a lot of the people in this sample were absolutely, like, they were gaming once a week, which I think is really, really cool. So the vast majority, about 70+%, were people who were really, really invested. So a lot of people saw the diversity of my sample and said, well, they're not real board gamers. And I'm like, no, they actually are. They're gaming at like 70.7%, at least once a week.
Wow.
And so that was a really cool finding too, because mostly it was people with Board Game Geek profiles that filled out the research. So you've got a whole community of folks who are accessing Board Game Geek, voting, messaging, participating, and have profiles on Board Game Geek, but don't post to fora, don't post to the forums. And a lot of folks shared with me, yeah, I wouldn't dare do that. Because sometimes, and moderation's gotten so much better on BGG, it's really great. But a lot of people are like, I just stay quiet, because it's never really that safe to engage with, board game, tabletop, role playing online, because you get a lot of backlash. And so that was an interesting finding too.
Wow. So, you finished, right? You have your defense. Was there anything? Obviously, you found a lot of things. So this is all published. I don't know if it's online yet. I know I checked your site. I wasn't sure if I saw that. Is that coming?
Yeah, it is going to. It's so there's a whole process. I didn't know this myself, but it goes to my library first. So as soon as I get the little alert that says, hey, it's been added to the collection, you then can access it through the library, the academic library, my Toronto Metropolitan Library first. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm going to be launching a video version of the dissertation, where it's basically going to be just so people can consume it in sort of bite-sized chunks. Because I have found that people are very exhausted and inundated, and they don't necessarily want to read tons of stuff. My dissertation is 230 pages long. So maybe people won't consume that, but they might consume some of the video content. I have been providing sneak peeks through Our Family Plays Games, Miklos and Starla Fitch. That's their channel. And we've been doing through the Voices program, some sneak peeks of my dissertation research through their channel. And we're hoping to make my dissertation available to everybody through that channel as well. So that's in the works.
That's fantastic. Well, you're a CAR-PGA member, so we absolutely would love to anything you want to share. We're happy to share with the membership, and we do have our own YouTube channel because that's where this will be. Nice. So we're happy to share it there as well.
Cool.
So that's fantastic. Very exciting. Anything else on your PhD before we talk about COVID?
Just PhDs are hard and expensive.
Talk to me. How long did it take?
So I was expecting that I would motor through, because I'm a former corporate branding person like yourself.
Yeah.
And timelines. I'm a certified project manager. I thought I'll just zip through this thing. No. So COVID hit right as I was about to launch my research. You have to go through a research ethics board, which is a very fiddly process, but I'm really glad that, researchers have to do that. You have to justify everything you're about to do. And as soon as I got the approval for my research ethics board, COVID hit in March. 2020. So it took about 5.5 years, which is a little longer than I wanted to spend.
Yep.
But it's, it's a slog. Like PhDs are, and you're meant to, you're meant to be doing novel research. It can't be something anyone else has done. So it's a bit lonely. And there's not a lot of research in this particular area. This is basically a bit of a foundational work, which I hope people will want to layer on top of as they do research. But yeah, PhDs are long and hard, so very grueling process.
Noted. Yeah, and you mentioned COVID. So, one of the things I think is sort of fascinating is we obviously have this intersection of sort of these digital communities, as you mentioned with Board Game Geek, and then you have sort of these other pieces of these all other trends that were happening wherever they were happening in these spaces that may not have gotten as much attention as they would have normally, but COVID changed the game a little bit. So I was wondering if you could talk about what you saw in terms of how that changed. I'm sure it put stressors on a lot of things that were probably stress points to begin with, and they probably sort of exploded or it became much more transparent, but love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Was doing a lot of research about how times of great like economic downturn. There was a great story, the inventor of Scrabble was actually, unemployed for a prolonged period of time during the Great Depression, and, came up with Scrabble because he was, literally reading newspapers and trying to figure out, what his next play was. And I think that one of the interesting things about the pandemic was it kind of heightened interest in tabletop gaming, staying home. I actually got a lot of really interesting feedback from folks because I immediately pivoted, changed my survey to kind of look at different measures in terms, and you're trying to triangulate by asking questions repetitiously throughout the survey. And, one of the things that I found was kind of interesting was, how much do you play games now? How much do you play games before what type of games, frequency? And so it was really interesting to see, once a week was about the same. It was 19% before. Now it's a little more at 22.9%. So it's a slight increase. They were gaming a little bit more, 2 to 3 times a week, wound up being a little bit less. So what was interesting to me was, there was a lot more sort of intimate play groups, obviously. And one of the other really interesting sort of bottom line findings was a lot of folks who have that diverse pool that we've talked about, where it's, identities that don't always, engage more publicly with board gaming topics or tabletop. What was interesting was a lot of people said I tended to avoid public board gaming events even before the global pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I harp on about, and if for folks who have seen my Medium articles, you probably know, I'm looking at math. And I'm basically saying, and this is something I used to say to clients as well, you got to look at the demographics on the ground. And I, sort of issued a stark warning on Twitter with the ongoing pandemic. There is a saturated, so it's a lot like, the Jeffrey Moore crossing the chasm old tech idea that, like a war game term, you establish a beachhead with a particular population, and that's your core base. But you must, at some point, radiate out from your beachhead. You got to do it, right? And you got to make those concentric circles bigger, and you got to make the tent bigger. You have to do it because vitality, the demographic change in Canada and the US, and I specifically looked mostly at North America, is that you're looking at most major urban centers at 50-50 in terms of BIPOC and white residents. You're looking at a little more than half of your population in both Canada and the US. Weirdly, there are more women than men in both cases. So you have to start thinking as a company, you've got your beachhead there, and frankly, I make an argument in the dissertation. I want to blow that out a little bit more. That there's even a genre of like couples talking about getting rid of games. They're usually white couples. They're usually affluent couples, and they're saying we have so many games. Oh no, what are we going to do? You've got market saturation in a certain demographic. So it's sort of incumbent on publishers to start now thinking about You got your beachhead, you own them. Now you have to bring more people into this hobby. And some of these issues, and I sort of triangulate a bunch of them, delimit board gaming and delimit tabletop, because people can't see themselves. Those who are playing, who are diverse, are playing with a certain discontent. They're avoiding public events because they don't feel good there. They feel out of place. They feel sometimes like it might be, a little transgressive feeling, like all eyes are on you, like, what are you doing here? I've had that feeling, going to certain gaming events where it's like, what is she doing here? And it's hard, right, to kind of stick with it. So that's sort of the interesting dynamics around COVID are, I think, publishers need to push through the conceptual barriers they have in their brains about what a gamer is. Who wants to game? Everybody does, I contend. And the COVID pandemic made the circle smaller, but I think, again, that creates an opportunity for publishers to do better and make better content and support diverse content creators to get out of that box of the saturated beachhead base.
It's fascinating you bring this up. We've certainly seen it in the tabletop space, which is that there was a lot of criticism around Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing tropes. And I think a lot of people felt they were under siege and they couldn't understand where it was coming from. Well, pretty sure where it came from was a much more diverse audience looking at this critically, who didn't come up through the ranks, but were looking at it fresh eyes, but from a very different perspective. And that's where you get things like X cards and some other safety tools that some gamers probably didn't feel that they needed for the industry. But now you have people who are absolutely coming from different backgrounds. Some of those backgrounds involve very different experiences where, yeah, there are some sensitive subjects, but maybe the folks around your gaming table you didn't think was an issue, but it doesn't mean it wasn't. And so a lot of these things came up, and I think the community was taken a little bit by surprise because it was a indicator of diversity. And that's one of the things I think we've tried to emphasize at the CAR-PGA was this is really a outcome of popularity. The good news is when you get more popular, you get a more diverse audience. For some people, what that means, though, is that you actually get more criticism, too. And I think that sometimes surprises people, including publishers, who are a little blindsided when all of a sudden things that they may have taken for granted, like talking about race instead of species or backgrounds, becomes a flashpoint. So I think it's fascinating because, to your point, and I think you said it, essentially this is reflective of the populations, and there are obviously factors that, if you don't address them, potentially are limiting your ability to sell product.
Yeah, 100%. And it's a really interesting thing. It's like having company over, right? When you have company over, like not recently, but people will notice, hey, your picture's hung a bit crooked, because they're coming to your space with completely fresh eyes, and that's I think. There was a lot of tropes in D&D just as a woman that I would think, oh, that's unfortunate. Like there was, some regulations that a female character could never ever be stronger than a male character, no matter how much she leveled up, right?
Yep.
Her fingers were a little more slender, so she could pick locks just a bit better. My fingers are not slender in any way. So you've got some of these interesting ideas, and that comes back to who authors games, right? Mm-hmm. That would stick out as a sore thumb. If I were making a game, I wouldn't make that mistake, right? Because I would know how that would land. That would be bad with a certain audience, and so you need diversity in the mix at almost all levels to make sure that people, can see themselves, feel respected and honored. We look for our faces. We look for ourselves in the media we love, right? Where even I watch little kids playing sometimes and they're like, that's me, I'm Wonder Woman, right? And you want to see that in the games and your entertainment products because life is hard and you want an escape. And you want to feel there's all kinds of really interesting theories around representation, but it can even make you feel like you're special. There's this, it's called the vitality framework, where if you see yourself on TV and like represented in some way, you actually feel like you might be a little super heroic or special. And a lot of identities don't get that at all. And you can see there's a wonderful, if anyone has time, this month, there's a great documentary called Is That Black Enough for You? And it's basically about Black representation in cinema and how it landed with, and they have amazing interviews with like Lawrence Fishburne and like a whole raft of, like, they talk about Sidney Poitier and how transformative representation can be to communities. So it's super duper important, and it's really, really important to the health and vitality as people sort of looking. There's some economic indicators that indicate that the growth might be slowing a little bit, particularly in tabletop. How do you fix that? You fix that by radiating out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's fantastic. And certainly a lesson, I think, that any publisher, and I think many of them are taking that to heart, but some of them get pushed there and some of them get there naturally on their own. So you can do it the easy way by listening to your customers, and the ones you don't have, but you would like to have, or you can do it the hard way when you just stop selling things. So I think both of those are, hopefully most folks are getting the message. So anything on this before we go to the next topic? Because I know you have slides.
This is great.
Excellent. So you mentioned it's on your website talking about games making games. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, yes. I love this group. They're great. When I first moved back to Toronto, I adore them. They're a great collective, just downtown Toronto, and they do workshops, teaching, symposia, all kinds of things. Like I did a bunch of VR hackathons with them. They're amazing. And basically, it's just a space for gender diverse folks. That like a really, really warm, nurturing, welcoming environment. They give me so many cool ideas for like really cool like instructional games. They do tech workshops, and they're really trying to create a pipeline for people who are interested in making, designing games, coding games. It's both tabletop and video games, and it's a dedicated sort of workspace as well. And they do exhibits. I can't say enough good things about them. They're a really, really great organization.
That's awesome. Is it in person, online, both? Is it a hybrid kind of?
Yep.
Both.
And they're very, very, they care a lot about accessibility. So, they help low income women and gender diverse folks, people who maybe have childcare responsibilities and can't always make it out. So they'll make a virtual option, which I really like, single parent. So you sometimes you lose access to some of these types of events and tools because you have, we all have lots of other responsibilities, and they really privilege, making sure that everybody gets access. And, some things are free if you don't have a lot of income. They have a sliding scale for membership. They're super cool.
That's fantastic. So we'll definitely be sure to link to, I certainly see at least a few websites. Looks like they're on Instagram, they're on Twitter and a few places. So we'll put that in our summary as well. Excellent. Okay, well, now obviously you've, I know it's not that long ago, so you've got your PhD. That's a huge achievement. Congratulations again. So now, new year, what's in store for you next? What's up next?
So the video version of my dissertation, because I really want to make sure that I'm honoring all the folks who gave me their stories. As I did this research, I want them to see their content up, with anonymity, so they can share their stories in a way that's safe. And so that video version, I have so many articles that I have written that I have not published yet. So we were just talking about how I have a very strange essay about Western Satanism and the Satanic Panic, and how I personally contend that Western Canada can be blamed to some small degree for the D&D panic, because there was this weird book, Michelle Remembers, that came out in BC, British Columbia. Anyway, I have lots and lots of pieces pending. And I think I'm going to keep at this. I'm also thinking of relaunching the survey that I did for the dissertation, just so I can get some new data. And that's something I'm looking for some sponsorship and funding for, with a couple of academic institutions. So fingers crossed. And yeah, that's, and I'm on Twitter a lot. And all the new Mastodon and Spoutable, all the, diaspora Twitter, all the experience.
The Twitter fallouts. Yep. That's
Yep.
great. That's
And I'm
fantastic.
trying to get my daughter into Call of Cthulhu, which is happening with middling results right now, and we may even film ourselves because it's goofy. Yeah, but yeah, that's what I'm up to right now. And I'm not gonna. I don't know that I'm gonna do more Medium articles. It's a very interesting format, but I think it's tough for people to access those. So I am looking for other vehicles.
Fantastic. Well, the CAR-PGA is here for you to the extent that you're willing to share previews, anything, or if be it with, actually as a platform, or if you want to just amplify it and have us share it, that would be very exciting for us. We would love to do that because I think that's a huge opportunity to you certainly have an audience who's engaged and interested in that. That's just as a side note, did your daughter come around to Call of Cthulhu, or was there sort of gaming in the air, or is it just because obviously there's something runs in the family kind of thing? How did the gaming approach go? I'm just curious.
She was not having it. I dragged her to D&D nights. She was not having it. She has slowly come around. We died so horribly in Call of Cthulhu
Well, it's
twice.
Call of Cthulhu, but yes, yeah.
No, and I'm told that was maybe not my best first, next volley. She was like, "We're dead. We're dead again." So yeah, I hear tell that it's just that's a thing. But yeah.
Yes, it's interesting. So my son and my nephew, within the same month, totally different states, totally. Now my son never had a chance, right? So obviously, like since 4 years old, I think I made up a D&D version for him. We've been talking about gaming forever. He's played more D&D in his entire lifetime than some people who've just been introduced to it. So he definitely gets D&D. Not that interested. He really, like he likes it, but he's just not, it's not like he wants to go play it. All of a sudden, he joined a group. And I was over the moon. And I was like, do you need miniatures? Do you need terrain? Like, I have a game space in my basement. And it turns out they played online anyway, which was fine. But we were laughing because I was very excited. And I was like, nobody make any sudden moves. Let's be cool about this. Let's not try and overwhelm him. And their first game was hilarious. It involved being eaten by a Tarisk, so it just goes to show you how the game went. And but it was very entertaining, and I was excited about that. My nephew, I just went all out. It was like, okay, Uncle Mike's going to send all this kind of cool D&D stuff, and I sent him paints, and he was like, "What are these paints for?" Because I didn't realize, of course, he didn't have miniatures. So I took it for granted. So it's very interesting when you're looking at different generations and their entry to it, because, obviously there's so much to gaming. It's frankly as diverse as art can be. And how you engage is fascinating. But I will say that I know the power fantasy of D&D is what very often appeals, and as you get older, I think Call of Cthulhu becomes much more entertaining. Certainly for me, I had my Call of Cthulhu phase as well, because then you're not just about like, oh, I want to be this amazing character. You're like, I don't, what, maybe we're just going to face down the horrors, and if I die, that's okay. So it's always interesting to see how those inverse power structures sort of inform people's experiences, but hopefully she'll come around.
She's desperately curious about how we can replay to see if we can survive this, and I don't think we're going to, but we can try.
Yes.
I bought hats. The hats
I
were
love
involved.
it.
I bribed her with 1920s hats. So
Oh, that's fantastic. My daughter loves anime, and the number of anime that is so D&D obvious, and I'm like, this is, and she's like, well, yeah. So she's been in my campaigns for a while, but it's something that we keep going. Okay, how about now? So we did get a new conversation today about going to conventions. And my son said, we were like, oh, we were thinking about being on a panel at one of these conventions. And my son was like, well, I was going to go to that convention. And my head exploded right there. Just so I was like, wow, okay, we're turning a corner. So here's to future geekdom. That
right.
would be exciting, I hope, and good luck to you as well. So I see your link there. You have on the screen. You have Twitter and your website. Thank you. What else can we do to support and follow you?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, you can follow me on Twitter, and I actually need to put my Mastodon. I'm on, it's the tabletops.social of Mastodon. It's just Pobuda. And I participated in a recent book called, it was Material Cultures, and it's my very first chapter in a book. and I can send out a link. It's a very great, it's an academic book, so it's extremely expensive,
Yeah, of
but
course.
it is a very, very interesting study of just the materiality of gaming and like all the dynamics of tabletop. It's a fascinating book about just tabletop cultures. It's super cool.
That's amazing.
It's called
So, and obviously your video's coming, right? So we will be able to share that and follow it, hopefully. And it sounds like you'll be updating your website with more information too. So hopefully we can share that as well.
And I do participate with Our Family Plays Games,
Mhm.
which is out of Nebraska. It's they're my favorite people in board gaming, and they just invited me to do a regular sort of monthly spot with them, and it's on our OFPG Voices, Our Family Plays Games Voices.
Oh,
So if
nice.
you haven't already followed them, they're the best. They're the best people, and it's Our Family Plays Games on YouTube.
Fantastic. We will definitely put that in I almost said show notes. I'm doing a podcast next. So we're not show notes, but in the YouTube summary, as well as our newsletter. So we'll make sure we have all of that. So that's fantastic. Okay. Anything else you'd like to add before we open it up for questions?
No, this is great. Thank you so much.
I love it. That we could easily talk for hours. So Trevor, did you have any questions that you wanted to ask? We'll give you some time.
The first thing that comes to mind is noticing the statistics of the slides. It seems really strange that the more than 2/3 of the respondents were female or non-gender specific, which seems completely out of line with the general consensus of how gaming and board gaming works. The world believes, or at least tends to act as if, the female representation is like almost non-existent. So I just thought it was fascinating that those numbers were there. Do you see a reason as to why those numbers came out that way? Was it because the sample that you drew upon the respondents fell more into that category because they wanted their voices heard, or is there another reason that maybe explains that interesting numerical difference?
So I really pushed. So there's a whole theory around, and this is a whole speech. Your referential sample should always reflect the population. And so you want, and sometimes it takes more work to get that to be so. So and I have a whole piece that I did about, when a referential sample is not like the general population, some systemic force, some force is stopping it from representing the population. So in the case of Canada and the US, which is the majority of the respondents, 50.5% of the population in the US is a woman, and 50.4% in Canada. I may have mixed those two up, but it's slightly more than half in both cases. And so what we ended up with was about 60%. So that's a little higher than the population. And I really worked so hard to make sure I heard from women. So I had specific invites. I went after, there's a Women in Board Gaming forum on the various fora. I went after Rainbow Board Gamers, Rainbow BGG in terms of promotion. And I really worked so hard to make sure that that I had a diversity of voices. And that was actually by intention. Because if I had just done sort of a more standard promotional campaign, I probably would have seen, like there's a couple of examples. Paxism did a survey where they got 99.9% males. Stonemeyer Games did demographic surveys for a few years, overwhelmingly men in every case. And it makes sense, because if you have certain communities that you target and you promote in certain ways, you're probably going to get a bit of a skewed sample, right? And actually, Elizabeth Hargrave did this amazing study of like Facebook groups and the gender split there. So if I were using some of those platforms, I would probably expect to see, maybe more men, right? And I really pushed in terms of invitations and letting women know, hey, I really want to hear from you. I kind of want to hear from you more than, other identities, because there's an underrepresentation there. So what's fascinating is a lot of my stats, and we won't go into all of them, actually map to population pretty well. as opposed to some of the other surveys. But I got tons of backlash about, well, okay, you got 60.4% women. That's not real gamers, which I thought was a really interesting finding in and of itself, right? If a sample skewed in that way, people started to get really, really suspicious about the findings, because they were like, well, but they're not real gamers though, right? And that was a huge thing. I have a whole FAQ about, how I promoted it and how this happened, but there was a lot of initial outrage about that sample, because people were like, you didn't locate true, real, quote unquote gamers. And it was really, really interesting. And I actually wrote a piece specifically about that, just to say, like, that's a really fascinating ideology, where it's like, if it's 60% gamer or 60% women, that's inclusive of trans women, by the way, then that's not quite right. Right. It's a really interesting thing, but you have to push really hard to get certain identities to participate in surveys, because in a lot of cases, it's not safe. Like, it's not safe to tell someone in certain communities that you're trans. And so I think that one of the things that I did with my survey and part of the ethics board was letting people know their information was safe with me. I wasn't trying to sell anything. They knew that I had very serious and strict data protocols. Yeah, so that's a huge question. It's a really good one, Trevor.
So how statistically variant was the 60% compared to the whatever the universal number would be for men to women composite gamers?
Yeah, that one of the really fascinating things, and I think this is another project for a much more well-funded group, is there was some attempts in previous years of almost like a gamer census, to get a true look at, okay, who is gaming. From a video game perspective, the average video gamer, so defined, is a middle-aged woman. Right, statistically speaking, that woman is spending, and again, it's a lot of perceptual challenges around what is a video game, and a lot of phone and digital games are actually selling and outselling some of the more sort of games we think about, right? So the average video gamer is a middle-aged woman. And that's really tough. A lot of people get really upset by that assertion, but lots of video game associations have done that research and realized, okay, that's a market, right? So it's not necessarily the 18-year-old, teenage white male suburban dweller that is the true gamer now. And similarly, we don't have a good census of board gamers, tabletop gamers, because it's again a real challenge around, there's not a lot of effort being placed in this. I'm not seeing a lot of publishers that do a lot of, large scale, like almost census activities. They should, or maybe they're opaque, like a lot of them are private companies, so maybe they are doing that research, but they're just not sharing. Stonemaier, like I said, made an effort to do demographic surveys, but they were super skewed.
I think it's also because depending upon the gamer, like I know my generation being in my 50s and being in the world that I'm in, I do not touch Twitch, or sorry, I do not touch Twitter. I don't do Reddit. When it comes to the questionnaires that D&D sends out, I'm pretty certain that my generation or my generation of gamers may be underrepresented because we're not people who respond to those kinds of social media inlets, and therefore, and that's why I think getting an actual census of gamers would be nigh impossible, because how do you possibly reach out to these people to get them as a respondent, other than going door to door, which would be absolutely insane. By the way, I love the game Masterpiece. I played it a lot as a kid, and I do remember the book Michelle remembers.
Oh my goodness! See, we had and I'm also in my 50s, Trevor. So
I'm Canadian. I'm down the road, and I'm in Brampton, so I'm not far.
Oh my God, that's great! I love Brampton. I'm just in the North York area, so yeah. Literally down the road.
Yeah. Well, relatively speaking, yes.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour and 3/4, depending on the highway.
We love Brampton because you've got great food there. So
Well, we have a very, very diverse population.
yeah, best Indian food in the city. It's amazing.
Thanks.
Any other questions, Trevor, or was that yours?
I think that covers me for now. I'd like to get into the full breakdown of the statistics and how those numbers break out, because I am curious, as you can see, how they compare to the normalization. Like, clearly there's a statistical variance there, and the question is that statistical variance significant? Is it indicative? Is it biased unintentionally or intentionally? And therefore, when you get into the numbers, you can maybe pick that apart a little bit more. So I'll wait until obviously the 200 and some odd pages are released, and then maybe dig into it some more.
Yeah, I hope to be able to provide a link to everybody at some point once my library has posted it. Yeah.
Because I am indicative of the wrong side of the equation in many ways, as far as a lot of these things are concerned, right? Because I'm white, I'm middle-aged, I'm well off, I'm a grognard, I'm all these things that basically is the side of the equation you don't want to be on necessarily. So it's interesting seeing that other breakdown, and as you pointed out, Mike, the looking at it with a fresh set of eyes from a different perspective and saying,
Yes.
okay, the things that we take for granted as just being tropes that we accept and we tolerate, maybe we need to reconsider and reanalyze.
Yeah, and I certainly, as I do work in the DNI space for my day job, one of the things my diverse team is fond of saying is we don't want to say anybody's wrong. We just want to say that we want better representation, right? So the point isn't that being white and male is a problem necessarily, but you want to open it up so it is reflective of the population. And I think everything that we just discussed is really essentially saying, there's a big wide world out there, and these games got their beachhead. Congratulations, but they now need to expand, and that's certainly something that I think everybody sort of conceptually, certainly business conceptually, says, well, I'd love to expand, more money, fantastic. I think practically that is a knotty conversation, because are you prepared to expand? Because coming with expansion means respecting people's groups and opinions you may not have considered. It means potentially changing your game to be more appealing, as certainly Dungeons and Dragons being sort of the North Star, you can see it happening. And the criticism that comes with it, because the game is not either changing enough or not necessarily flexing enough for everybody. And if you want to be, open to a broader population, this is the adult conversation that happens. It's certainly, again, I work for a Fortune 5 global company, has always, that's everybody gets it, because if you start playing globally, this isn't even a question, because there are absolutely societies that work on different levels, be it gender or, you take your pick, frankly. And so you have to flex there. But I think gaming's coming into its own. That's the good news. The bad news is we're about to get the D&D movie. I just wrote an article about it. And I think that is going to be, we have no idea what's coming when D&D gets, we think D&D is popular now, and therefore by proxy role-playing games and by proxy gaming in general, that's not video games. I think we're about to see a sea change if that movie does well, and everybody thinks it is. Certainly Hasbro is, they paid a $7 million 30-second spot for it during the Super Bowl. That's not somebody, they're not playing around. So they think it's going to be. It may not be, but they're acting like it is. And if it even sort of performs better than the movies in the past, I think we're going to see a massive influx of people who are fans of gaming and actually don't play them. So and that's going to be interesting.
So two quick things. One, last month you had Servant of Shiloh on, and if you watch some of his videos in his YouTube channel, he asks the questions that need to be asked in terms of why does the North American Black person not play role-playing games?
Yes, yes.
Is it because they're not represented, or is there other cultural things that are indicative to them? And if you drill down to those questions, then you can say, okay, how do we break these barriers and introduce these people to the game where they're not, not stymied. And then as far as the Dungeons and Dragons movie, I hope it's better than the first one, because when I went to the theater with the first one, it was me and my wife and one other person in the entire theater.
Oh, the number of disappointing movies that I thought were going to be the one. Yeah, we keep hoping this one will be Chris Pine, all of our hopes and dreams are with you. You know, white guy, but you know, we'll see. We'll see how we end up. But everything. This is a completely different topic, honestly. But everything is sort of indicating it's definitely going to be different. Whatever it is, it may fail, it may do well, but I think it's going to be talking about broadening your population. I think it'll be very interesting to see fans of something that don't play it. And I think, you know, we've seen that with comics, you know, where people get very defensive. They get like, well, you know, do you really, oh, you're a girl, and you like comics? Well, I'm going to examine you for 5 minutes to see if you really like it. Oh, you like this band? You're not a real fan, right? You thought it was bad before. Wait till the sea change of new fans, which we should be welcoming and be preparing for. If the movie does well, it's about to go to a whole new level. So, but
I question that on the fact that if you look at the Marvel movies that were really, really successful and have made billions and billions of dollars for Disney,
yes,
it has not in any way, shape, or form increased the sales of the comics. If anything, the comic sales are still decreasing on a regular basis. They are collapsing. To us, like the market itself is, you know, people are questioning whether it's going to last another 20 years. And that,
oh yeah, but to your point, that's not necessarily sales of comics. So I didn't say it benefit D&D.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is that, because the movie will benefit Hasbro, certainly.
Correct, and the brand. You know, one of the things is the SEO battles, right? So like, what happens when you search for D&D, and the first 10 terms are movie, not the actual game.
Well, could be. Yeah,
we'll see. I mean, maybe not. We'll see. We'll see. Anyway, all right. So on that note, though, we don't want to get too far off track because we will come back to that.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tanya Pobuda. You have been so gracious with your time, and I really appreciate you sharing your presentation. That was a lot of work. Thank you for doing that. I wish we could ask everybody just make. I'm not future speakers. I'm not asking you to do presentations. Thank you. She's now raised the bar to show high that no one else is going to do. But I really appreciate you doing that. And you're a member, so you're part of the family, as is Trevor. So we will absolutely invite you back. We hope you'll join other sessions. We hope you'll join voting. We certainly hope you'll contribute to the articles to our newsletter because we're always looking for new stuff. And we look forward to absolutely supporting your work in the future. It's really important. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this. I really, really enjoyed it.